see it in full throat this evening. Do consider complaining to the Environment Agency. Maybe they'll finally get round to doing their job. Who knows? But anyway, on a much happier note, it's my very great pleasure this evening to welcome my colleague and friend from the University of Manchester, Professor Dr. Christian Laes. Christian has addressed this branch before, but only via the means of Zoom, back when these things had to be on Zoom, and he expressed a wish to come in person, and here he is, and I hope he's going to enjoy his time this evening. So Christian is, like myself, a Roman historian, but a much less violent one. And it's fair to say that his interest is much more in Roman social history than mine. He's written extensively on these subjects. It is also fair to say that he's an eminent epigrapher. He works with lacunae, the record of newly discovered Roman inscriptions. And it's also, I think, right to mention that he is a great enthusiast for the Latin language. So Christian is one of these people who tries to keep the language actually alive as a living tongue. But this evening he's going to talk to us, as you can see on the screen, about disability and healing in Greek and Roman myth. And because you've come here to listen to him and not to me, without further ado, I shall pass over to Christian.
Thank you so much, Andy, for this kind introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks for coming, of course. I'm actually going to talk about my little booklet, which came out in May this year, actually in the Cambridge Elements series with Cambridge University Press. And this little book, has already brought me, I think, to something like 15 different places all over Germany, France, up to here in England, in the UK, of course. Only last week I was in Dublin for 2 days to do talks there. Then last Wednesday I was at Coventry, Warwick University, but I had never thought that the book would even bring me to such an exotic place like this building. So it's really nice to be here. I think it was 2021 that I did my talk on children in the Roman Empire via Zoom, but I'm a keen traveler, so I'm always happy to be at different places. Let me just briefly sketch you the story of this book. So I arrived in Manchester in 2018. I always was an avid reader, but as I always travel from Altrincham, South Manchester, to the University of Manchester, I use the tram, and I just like to read on the tram, preferably not on my phone, just reading. And so I developed a great love and passion for this wonderful English tradition of these pocket books and brief introductions, all that kind of things. And well, 2 and a half years ago, Michael Sharp of Cambridge University Press suddenly asked me, would you like to do one of these Cambridge Elements? I thought, why not? I, who have read so many pockets, why would I not write one myself? Another reason why I wanted to do it was the subject that was kind of imposed on me. I've been working on disabilities in antiquity extensively since, I'd say, 2008, 2009 on. But I always had the idea that I could say more about religion and disability, mythology and disability. And so suddenly this book was proposed to me, so I thought, why not do it? And it was really, took me 3 or 4 months to write it, but it was really a joy to do it, and it's even much more pleasure just to share this knowledge with people all around the world, I'd say. Okay, next one. Just very briefly, it would be very unfair to say that I'm the first dealing with disability history for the ancient world. It all started already in 1995 with this book by Robert Garland, The Eye of the Beholder. It basically says it all. It says, whether you were considered as disabled in the ancient world or not, belonged really to the opinion of people judging about you. So it could be used against you in a certain situation, it could be used ad hoc against a political opponent, and in other situations, it wouldn't really matter. So it's really all in the eye of the beholder. 1997, this one, wonderful book. 3 weeks ago I was in Exeter, finally met Daniel Ogden, who wrote on this very specific tradition, Greek tradition, of so-called dynasties of crooked kings. So kings being punished for a sort of sin or a mistake that was made some generations before, they're being punished by a physical disability, but they still being kings. 1997. 2003, this one came out by Martha-Lynn Rose. Look at the cover, which has Oedipus. That is the reason, of course, why I also chose for an Oedipus cover. The Staff of Oedipus, 2003, deals with disability in classical Greece, so ancient Greece, really 5th and 4th century BCE. It's a wonderful monograph. When I read that one, I thought, well, I would ever like to write a similar thing for what I mainly study, the Roman world, and this happened in 2018. So this is my Cambridge University Press monograph that came out in 2018, a social and cultural history of disabilities and the disabled. Now, if you want to study a topic like this, these matters are about early Islam, early Christianity. So it really takes antiquity from, let's say, 3000 BCE up to 700 CE. It's 35 chapters and more than 30 contributors. Of course, you know this wonderful series, the Bloomsbury series, A Cultural History of. I think there's 40 or 50 of them already now. There's also a cultural history of antiquity. Nowadays in osteology, bioarchaeology, this is really a good one. Specifically on the ancient Greek world, and even doing more than just disabilities, also about marginalized populations. I need to tell something about disabilities, about disabilities, myths, and religion too. What did I not want to do? I didn't want to write a new book in this tradition of the so-called. They sort of made clear that antiquity continues to make people enthusiastic, continues to appeal to people, but it's not the kind of book I wanted to write. I also explicitly wanted to do more than just writing about Greece, let alone Athens, and Rome, let alone the city. I didn't strive for any exhaustivity. That is just not possible. There's encyclopedias for this, there's wonderful scholarship on this, by the way, already from the 19th century. So you can't expect a book of 80 pages to have all instances of all disabled gods and heroes in Greek. And not being healthy, not being able, being somehow disabled. Next one. Okay, I will be the first to admit that studying disability in the ancient world is in some way an anecdote and aid, but they belong to a different category within the state. If you ever want to read a book about this, this is a really wonderful one by another scholar named Rose, so not Martha-Lynn Rose, but Sarah Rose, No Right to Be Idle, the Invention of Disability. And look at the first date, 1840. Now, should we be afraid of this anachronism? I don't think so. From the second would be the view from the outsider, which basically means that in every society you would see man fancying man. Man having sex with other men. That would be the ethic. What was the terminology to say blind, and so on and so on. So we should realize that we are dealing with anachronisms, but we should not shy away from the problem because of the fear for this anachronism. I won't go into great detail now. I just want to tell you that some people even disclaim the term disability. And they will say, well, if you say disability, it may be one by one, and maybe yeah. First, briefly something about religion in antiquity. If you allow me to quote myself, I will just read like 10 lines what I wrote about religion in antiquity, because these are important things. It is important. A strict distinction between the sacred and the profane was never made. The gods and divine powers were working within the world. No strict barrier existed between religion and ordinary life. Religion made few ethical demands, little notion of sin, no prescribed rules of life, no denial. Hephaestus' limb, and then I have to tell you, this doesn't exist. There is not one canonical version of it. In writing of this book, I read a lot of ancient mythographers, so people like Hyginus, Antonius Liberatus. Some scholars would say that the Greeks had myths while the Romans had legends. I do not believe this. I would say that to the Romans, Book 1 of Livy, which basically deals with the legendary first origins of the city of Rome, that it had the same word as Homer to the Greeks, with the Iliad and the Odyssey, of course, having many gods also being involved. So I would also regard legends with heroes as foundational stories, as something that comes close to myths too. Yeah. Be careful with things like this. So the idea that the Greeks in the 6th, 5th century BCE had this sort of transition from myths to reason, logos, also in Hellenism, but also before with philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, gods still play an important role. Myths are still very important there too. This is often a prejudice which comes from the Enlightenment, yeah? But this Enlightenment, like pure transition from mythos religion to logos, was really not ever there in antiquity. Next one. Yeah. Also this. Atheism, this would be a whole lecture, of course. Atheism in antiquity, this is a very difficult concept. You read about people being called atheos, but this is more being skeptical about certain myths, about behavior of certain gods. It doesn't really equal our atheist. And then, let's go on. This is a very interesting equation made, by the way, you can click on following, by Plutarch in his little monograph on Isis. Plutarch would say, truth stands to myth as sun to the rainbow. So, because of the rainbow, we understand something of the nature of the sun. Because of the myths, we understand something about the divine truth. And as Andy mentioned already, as I like to work with inscriptions, I do something in the book also with this inscription, which is wonderful. It tells us a lot about what mythology really was about. It says here, tu qui legis, you who read this, et dubitas manes esse, and you who would doubt that there are gods of the underworld, sponsione facta invoca nos. Do your vow and call on us. And you will see that we work. You will see that we do something for you. So also that idea that gods are really there to do something for you is very prominent in ancient thinking. Okay, let's go to the next. If I would just ask you as a sort of quiz, could you name me some cases of disabilities or bodily suffering in ancient mythology? There's a fair chance that you would come up with cases like Prometheus, whose liver was like regularly picked out. It grew again, and then the bird came again to pick it out. Atlas, who had to carry the weight of the earth on the shoulders. This is pretty interesting too. These are gods, so Athena and Aphrodite, fighting with Diomedes and Aeneas as human warriors. Well, the main point is there, gods get hurt too in the Iliad. There's even a special name for the blood of the gods, that is ichor, but they suffer. They need to get healed by their father, by Zeus. And there's a very interesting passage in the Iliad where Ares, the god of war, is quite heavily wounded. He goes to the Olympus, Zeus heals him, and he says, "Thank you, Father. If you would not have done this, I would have remained amenenos for the rest of my life." This is something like strengthless, without strength. What is this? Is it sort of disability perhaps? So even a God could say, if I would not have gotten healing, I would have been in a, well, less preferable condition for the rest of my life. It is basically there in all mythologies. I mean disabled or wounded gods. This is wonderful. This is from Norse mythology, from the Edda, where you have Hodur, the blind god, and he's of course tricked by Loki to shoot an arrow to another god, a god or a hero who could not die except because of the mistletoe. And this is an arrow of mistletoe, and the blind god, in his ignorance, shoots, hurts the other god, who dies. The dying god goes to the underworld, and for this, Hodur is also punished, also goes to the underworld. So also in the Edda, in Norse mythology, there's blindness, there's a god being wounded, being killed, and so on and so on. This is the Ujat eye. Egyptian mythology, Horus loses his eye when fighting against his uncle Set. Set, who had killed Horus's father, Osiris. But then, of course, the different pieces of the body are being put together and then he resuscitates. But Horus loses his eye in this battle. And in Indian mythology, you have the idea also of primordial sacrifice. This is the god Bhaga, who loses his eyes during primordial sacrifice, but later on the eyes are restored. Okay. Let's move to chapter 2. So after the introduction, I start with a sort of descriptive catalogue, for which I use this scheme in Latin a capital, again in English from head to toe. And I start with the most difficult category. What is madness, or mania, or so-called mental disability? Just very briefly, there's lots of stories about heroes losing their temper, doing like atrocious things, and later, well, sometimes harming or even killing themselves because of the shame. Just one story here. Ajax, the Greek hero of Trojan War. Ajax, he's basically fighting his sheep, his cattle, because he thinks that he's fighting the Trojans. Everyone has been laughing at him. He's ridiculized because of this. Afterwards, he throws himself on his sword. Now, the interesting thing is, if you just scan all these stories, you will notice that this madness is often being brought by gods, but never by what we would call mad gods. She's one who is often involved, Lisa. She's not a mad goddess herself. On the contrary, she's depicted often as a young female huntress. Next slide. These are just inserted in my book after some, let's say, experiences during talks. When I did like the general talk on disabilities, there was always someone asking afterwards about the idea of trauma. And would that have existed in Greek mythology? Well, my answer would be yes, if you scrutinize the text and if you're very sensitive also for vocabulary. This is a wonderful case. Queen Creusa in the Ion by Euripides. She, many years before, before the plot of the tragedy, had been raped by Apollo in a cave. And she's reminded of this when she enters a similar place. So her son and other friends are asking, what is this? You seem so sad and so terrified. What is going on? She says, don't worry about me. There's nothing. No, nothing happened. Yeah, but can you tell us something? Why do you look so anxious? And then she tells the story of a friend of her who had been raped by Apollo. This is what psychiatrists call a substitution. So you tell the story as if it had happened to someone else. Then when the story goes on, there's this idea of, well, I have to disclose the whole thing, but I'm so much ashamed and I'm so anxious for what people would tell. So the anxiety and the shame is there. And then Euripides describes the idea of telling, reliving the experience of abuse. And when Creusa is telling this whole thing, she turns to the present tense. So suddenly she really, in Greek, also uses this present tense. There's interesting experiments up to nowadays where they have, mostly in America, war veterans sort of reenact ancient tragedies in order to cope with their trauma. The whole idea of Caesar in Vietnam, with some articles that came out end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. So every now and then you find this idea of what we would call psychological trauma. And for me, the interesting thing is that you should imagine this play on stage in Athens before an audience right after the Peloponnesian War, where quite some members of the audience perhaps have experienced the same things or knew about similar situations. Okay, we go from head to toe. So after the brain, to say so, we arrive at the eyes. Interesting question, are there any blind gods in Greek or Roman mythology? Well, actually there's only one case. And a very specific case, only in a comedy by Aristophanes, and later on in the 2nd century in a sort of satirical tradition, the Timon by Lucian. It is about Plutus. Plutus, who is the god of wealth. Now, why would he be blind? Well, he's actually being punished by Zeus because he always goes to the wrong people. And he wants to get healed, so that is basically what the play is about. So he goes to the sanctuary of Asclepius, and in the end he gets his healing too. Now I apologize for the words, but Plutus with Aristophanes, he has a limp, he's blind, he stinks, he's ugly, and even worse, he's circumcised. All this is basically in an allegorical tradition. Why is the god of wealth crippled? Because it takes such a long time, of course, before you get rich. Why is he blind? Because wealth often goes to the wrong people. The people who do not deserve it, the people who Zeus even did not want to be rich. Now, the old tradition is also there in the satirical Timon by Lucian, and some commentators would actually really recognize already in antiquity that this is an allegorical thing. If you look at depictions of Plutus, if you look at altars for Plutus, he's a young man with a cornucopia. Fertility is not blind at all. So it's only in a very specific situation that Plutus seems to be a blind god. But of course, in Greek myths, you have blind individuals. Here I want to stress that blindness is often considered as the worst possible punishment. Polymestor was a Thracian king who abused and maltreated one of Hecubas's sons. As a punishment, she, Hecuba of Troy of course, invites him to her tent, and she picks out his eyes with a needle, which, this is Greek tragedy, of course, you don't see it happening on stage, but you hear it off stage. And the text really has Polymestor saying, so he's screaming, of course, because of the pain, and this is described as a horrible punishment. Same thing, I don't think that I need to explain for you the myth of Oedipus, where blindness is, of course, prominently there. I do not know of any text saying that because of his blindness, Oedipus sort of acquired a new insight, that he sort of got rid of superfluous, superficial things, and that he got more insight because of his blindness. That is never there. So in the myth, the suffering of being blind is very much emphasized. The same for Tiresias. So if you scan Greek mythology, there's 4 generations of Thebes, and already in the first generation, you basically find Tiresias already as an old, so for a generation would be Laes and Oedipus, of course. You already find Tiresias as an old man and blind seer. By the way, why is Tiresias blind? Here's a very interesting story. Once he had seen 2 sacred snakes copulating. As a punishment for him seeing this, he was transformed into a woman. Later on, Zeus restored him. He became a man again. And then Zeus in Hera, in one of their famous quarrels, just called on Tiresias and asked him, well, you who have been a man and a woman, could you tell us which of the 2 has the most pleasure in sexual intercourse? And Tiresias reveals the secret. He says, woman, of course, for which he is punished by the gods. For revealing this secret, he is punished with blindness. Please think about this. So the stories about Tiresias are incredibly interesting for all sorts of practicalities regarding blindness. The authors will even ask questions. How can a seer see the birds in the sky and do predictions based on this when he can't see? How was he able to walk around? Well, he has servant boys acting as a sort of staffs for him. Okay, all these stories are there. But I challenge you to find one passage really saying that Tiresias was such a prominent seer because of his blindness. That is never there. The blindness, so the seeing is a sort of compensation, a sort of addition to the visibility of being blind. But there's never this direct link, you being respected, you being a fantastic seer because of your blindness. I think this is a very central thought throughout the book, and I really wanted to stress this here. Okay, let's move on. So we basically go from head to toe. So next one would be the ears. Would you have any deaf deities in Greek or Roman tradition? Actually, no. And this fits very much with all these public traditions of the ancient world. The closest you come are things like gods do not listen to us, they don't hear us. But that's of course not the same as deafness. As for the tongue not being able to speak, there are some interesting cases there. This is a wonderful example. She's Lara, Larunda, also called Lala, Lalein, which means to speak, of course, in Greek. What is the story here? Lara had seen Jupiter, Zeus, having intercourse with a nymph Luturna, actually raping Luturna. And, well, of course, she wanted to tell this to all other gods. She was punished by Zeus. She was made mute. She was struck by muteness. And what happens then? She's brought to the underworld, and Mercury, Hermes, takes advantage of her muteness, rapes her, because she can't tell it to anyone what had happened to her. And so she becomes this sad goddess who had suffered and made clear that she had suffered, but she couldn't even tell it to others. In Ovid's Fasti, she is linked to the ceremony of the Feralia, which is the 21st of February, and she is linked to the so-called not speaking or silent deity, the Dea Takita, in a sort of ceremony which involved also you being protected against the pollution of the evil tongue, against pollution of gossip. And I don't think I need to explain you the link, of course. Dea Lara, not speaking, and sort of protection against gossip. Which means that we've already arrived at the legs and at mobility impairment. This is really one of my favorite stories in the whole of the book. Here's Hephaestus, the limping god of the blacksmiths, the god of technique, the god of craftsmanship. This is interesting. It's described with Homer. Don't ask me about one canonical version with Homer because it's not there. Look at this. Iliad 1. Hephaestus is telling his mother here, "Mother, please be calm. Don't resist your husband Zeus. Because otherwise he will maltreat you. As he did with me, he will throw you off the Olympus, like I was thrown off the Olympus. I fled for 24 hours, and I just arrived on the island of Lemnos, and I was injured." Who sort of walk around or move automatically, because he's of course the god of craftsmanship, he's very cunning in creating all these things. He's hard work, he's always sweating. Oh, "Mother, I've created a wonderful throne for you." She sits on it, and she can't use it anymore. What happens? The gods have to look for a solution, and the only solution is, because Hephaestus doesn't want to listen, he wants revenge. They make him drunk. The Greek army could not stand this, and he was brought, interesting, in exile to the Isle of Lemnos. There's many similarities, by the way, with the figure of Hephaestus. It is said, some versions say that it was a wound in the leg, which caused immobility impairment. There's lots of passages about him being mocked. There's the Isle of Lemnos. There's also the idea of Hera being responsible for this. And on the other hand, so there's the disgust, there's the punishment. On the other hand, the injury matters only every now and then. So when the Greeks come back, begging Philoctetes to go back to the siege of Troy, he will first say, "Ooh, it hurts, I can't do it." But then when he gets good conditions, there's no wound anymore, he can do it, and in the later myths on Philoctetes, even going to Italy, founding colonies, there's nothing anymore about the disability or the wounds. So again, fairly contradictory statements on Philoctetes, who is sometimes called the new Hephaestus. Andy? Okay, of course, I could only conclude this chapter by referring to a scholar I deeply admire, Georges Dumézil. So he has really taken this sort of Indo-European approach, and he will say, well, there's many different myths, Indo-European myths, where there's talk of compensation and recompensation. This is Roman mythology, this is mythos Scaevola. Fighting against Porsena, the Etrurian king, burning his and losing, of course, his right arm. So he being a left-hander later on with a left arm, Scaevola, that he becomes a great Roman hero. This is in the Irish Celtic tradition. Nuada was the king of the De Danaan. What happens? Because of his having lost his right hand, he could not be king anymore. A new king comes, who is a bad king, of course. So Nuada returns because he got prosthesis, right hand. Norse mythology, Tyr, who put for an oath, who put his hand in the mouth of the wolf Fenrir, loses his hand. And this is, again, primordial sacrifice in Indian mythology. This is Savid. She loses both hands, which are both recompensated again after primordial sacrifice, recompensated by golden prosthesis. So this seems to be a red thread throughout Indo-European mythology. People sacrificing something and getting a prosthesis in return. Yes. Right, disabilities is of course a vague term. So what I did in chapter 3 is going to other, let's call it oddities, things which are not really frequent, and would these things be considered as disabilities or not? I said something about teratology, which is the science of monsters in antiquity. Of course, Greek mythology is full of monsters, titans, giants, people with individuals with 100 arms, so the hekatoncheires, the cyclops with the one eye. They're all children of first gods Uranos and Gaia. But, next one, they are not at all impaired. Georges Dumézil makes the point that there is an obvious link between monstrosity and basically doing what you want as a god sovereignty. In later traditions, some babies were called monsters. This had a serious disabling effect, but in most myths it isn't really there. Interesting too, they existed. So even when you think always about enlightenment and so on, most ancient writers would agree that there is something, that exists something like cyclops, like centaurs, even what we would call scientific writers. They are seldom worshipped. So you don't find much votive inscriptions for an hekatoncheir, for instance, or for titans. Next one. No. They are depicted in many different ways. And I also ask in this section of chapter 3 something about identity, because that's also a question that comes up so often. Is it possible that these myths worked in such a way that some people recognize themselves in these individuals? I point to some cases. So there's quite some historical individuals being nicknamed the Cyclops, as Philip of Macedon was. What would that mean? If you're sort of identified with such a monster as Cyclops, what would it mean if you were one of the monsters at the imperial court of the so-called mad emperor Heliogabalus? So we have a whole collection of monsters, and it is thought that after he was killed, assassinated in 220, that it was decided that these monsters had to go to different cities because not one city wanted to have the whole group of them together. So these were often what we would call individuals with disability. How would they have looked at themselves being nicknamed like these mythological monsters? This is, of course, in a humoristic context, that Ovid will describe the Cyclops Polyphemus courting beautiful Galatea. And he says about himself, well, when I think of it, I'm actually not ugly at all. Look at my eyebrows, they have something special. Look at my eye, it's special. I'm actually beautiful, I'm not a monster. This is interesting again. Would some individuals have recognized this? Would it have meant something for their personal lives? Maybe. Of course, I'm sure that there's a possibility. I will be very brief about the other categories. Just say that in mythology, of course, you find people of small stature, so-called dwarfs. This is very interesting. This is Bes in Egyptian mythology, but there's not one writer really explaining to us who Bes was, but you find him all through the Hellenistic and the Greco-Roman age, often with a protruding tongue. He's small, the limbs do not seem to be in the right proportion, but it's also a lot of fertility. And he protects women in childbirth, and so on and so on. There's also this story, which is beautiful, of course, about the blind giant who has a dwarf on his shoulders. The dwarf who basically leads him through the streets and leads the way, while Hephaestus, with his limp, is just holding the hand of the giant. So the combination of three disabilities. This anthropologists will tell you that in certain cultures, being twins could be a disability. The trace you find there in Greco-Roman mythology is the idea of one of the two being the weaker part of the twins. Think about Hercules, Iphicles. And this is often connected also to the idea of a woman being pregnant by two men, a god and a human individual. And then the stronger part of the twin is, of course, the one with divine origin, and the other is just the ordinary human being. But a disabling effect of big twins is very rare in antiquity, which is sort of obvious. Wasn't Rome originally founded by twins Romulus and Remus? And isn't there in the Roman tradition the idea or the story about the triplets, the Horatii, who fight the Curiatii in early Rome? So also there is not really a disabling effect in this. Interesting to think about this old age, the disability. Some people say yes. Gods never age. Titanos asked for immortality, got it, but forgot to ask for eternal youth. Just shriveled away, regretting that he had ever asked for immortality. No? Gods do not get old, according to Hesiod. The first race of humankind, the golden race, they just lay down, asleep, and died, but they never knew any old age, like here, of course, Aeneas carrying his father on his back after Troy was set to fire. By the way, ancient writers would also say this is not really disability, but interesting that there's one thing human beings can do which gods cannot, that is take your own life. Gods, by definition, are immortal, so they cannot decide to commit suicide. Alright. Chapter 4. This also seems to be a red thread throughout mythology and religious priests. So the ones involved in sacrifice should have able bodies. When you read literature about this, it's always referring to 3 or 4 fragments. This is one of those, which basically goes back to some legendary stories. You can read it here for yourself, in Latin and in English. Please always be careful with quotes. This is just a small quote from a whole controversia by Seneca and Elder, and it will basically continue with stories telling us that despite disability, the priest could still perform sacrifice. So there is the idea, profoundly mythological idea also, that nature has something harmonious, so that the people performing sacrifice should also be somehow harmonious. In practice, it's often a matter of coping with reality, ad hoc solutions. The story I so much like is one from the Judaic tradition, where it is said, rabbis and the ones who read from scripture in synagogue should not be blind. And then someone in the commentary writes, but Rabbi so-and-so is blind. And the answer is, yes, but we got used to it. So the very practical thing, very different from the theory of a priest, integri corporis. So he has to be without any blemish. Which brings me to chapter 5, where I deal with Christianity and monotheism. First of all, some patristic writers will also defend an idea you already find with pagan writers like Varro or Dionysius of Halicarnassos. This is the Theologia Mythica, saying that theology basically just reflects something about a higher truth, but that the anthropomorphism never be taken at face value. And of course, we find plenty of Christian critics on gods being depicted as human beings, the so-called anthropomorphism. So you'd expect that there would be a lot of critique also by patristic writers on, what is this? These pagans, they even had gods with impairments. Well, that plays a very, very minor role in the discourse of everything. So it's not something that seems to strike the Christian apologists and the Christian writers that much. And by the way, there's a whole theory of teratology also with St. Augustine and the monastic writers. This is one of the first desert fathers, I think it's Anthony or Pachomius, and he meets a centaur in Paul, and he meets a centaur in the desert. This is meant as a true story. So these things exist, and St. Augustine will say they are all part of the plan of God with the world at large. We don't understand it, but they are part of His great plan. Interesting. I think that we can basically say that miracles performed by Jesus Christ, stories which were told and retold every single time, that in a way they also, I'm not speaking about historical truth or not, but that in a way they also functioned as foundational stories, as sort of myths. Which brings in very interesting questions. Is Jesus not healing the blind, the deaf, the mute, the crippled, the leprous, the possessed? And aren't saints always sort of reproducing these same miracles? So it might cause certain categories of disabilities being established. When you turn to monotheism, you get nagging questions about things like the theodicy and divine justice. If God is good, why does this happen to my child? Where's the justice? And there's only one God that you can blame, so you cannot turn to another God to ask him or her for healing. Some scholars, like Cardinal Moss, have written about this, that in the Christian stories, the mutilated body becomes more and more important. And then they speak about a sort of inverted kalokagatia, because in the Greek-Roman tradition, you are beautiful and good, your body is beautiful, this reflects also your inner goodness. But what if you start off worshipping mutilated bodies? What about this? We will all raise on Judgment Day with our perfect bodies. So John, who has always been the blind man of the village, he will suddenly see. What does it mean? Does it mean that in the eyes of God, the disability has never mattered? He's really John, so his blindness doesn't really matter? Or is it sort of the idea that this is something you need to get healed from, something that needs to be taken away from the individual? Interesting book, absolutely. As for the other one too, I don't agree with the conclusion, but it has interesting documentation. What if the bad guys, the ones in hell, which of course sort of mythology too, are also the disabled ones? There's a whole tradition, an apocryphal tradition of stories about hell and apocalypse and so on and so on, and there are disabled who are in hell. Megan Henning makes a very strong case that this is sort of moral judgment, and she will even blame these authors, but also someone like Dante, so like also in the Inferno of the Divina Commedia, she will blame these writers for the sort of negative judgment about disabled people, which that existed up to nowadays in contemporary society. I would be very cautious with an argument like this. I think it's very much more an ad hoc thing, so the idea that there is something like beauty and things we do not really prefer. Black, also the color black, is often negative, or white is good. And I'm not sure whether this would imply that we will always have such a view also on these people when we meet them in daily life. But these are theories that exist too. And I come to a conclusion. So just think about this, or if you would ever read the book for yourself and do a whole experiment of thought with this, there is a website, We Capable, and this basically deals with mythology from India, ancient India. And it claims that this mythology is full of disabled gods, and that this is, and the website makes a strong case for emancipation of disabled individuals based on these ancient Indian myths. Now, I once talked to this with a scholar, one of these very few scholars who specializes in Sanskrit and Vedic texts. He told me that perhaps 1 in 1,000 of these texts have been properly edited, published, commented on. That you should be very, very careful with such generalizations, because you hardly have any good documentation for this mythology. How happy are we as classicists? Of course, we have everything. We have text editions. We can look in lexica, we have commentaries, and so on and so on. So, but please be very careful with the sort of generalizations of the idea of ancient myths as emancipatory things. I would be very careful with this, and I would say that you can't really use the Greek and Roman tradition for this. I would say that the question about the combination of disability and mythology says a lot also about our culture and about ourselves perhaps, or our present day sort of contemporary obsession also with perfect bodies. Please think about this. We are basically confronted with perfect bodies every single hour of the day. It's everywhere, it's on television, it's on advertisements, you can watch them on your smartphone, whenever you want. 5 years ago, I had one of the best travels I've ever done, the incredible opportunity of traveling to Iran for 2 weeks. And one of the first things that struck me when I came back in the European airport is you see these advertisements, commercial things, and it's often nudity, nakedness, and it's all perfect bodies. There are many cultures in which you do not often see such bodies. When a writer like Galen writes on perfection, harmony, the crepon, it's more about the thing that is more preferable than the other thing. It's not so much about imposing an ideal of beauty. How could he? I know, some people tell me, yeah, but Galen also had, he also worked with numbers for ideal proportions and so on and so on. That is true. But this is never a sort of normative imposing of numbers. So we started with the development of mathematics and Laes Pascal and so on, which is a very typical thing for the 19th and 20th century medical practice. So that is really not there with Galen. And I would also like to make the point that some people say, well, of course, beauty, the idea of the perfect body in antiquity was there. And then they always refer to these statues, which is classical sculpture. Where would you see these statues? Much more you would see a Hellenistic tradition, which went all the way into the Roman period, which is a tradition like this. The grotesque body. These were the sort of little statuettes which exist in thousands. And this is a wonderful book by Anastasia Mentani. She will basically make the point that the interpretation of these statues are multiform. Right? It can be showing like, well, look at this variety in life. There's all these different forms. It is about mockery, obviously. It's also about degrading these people. It's about poverty. It is saying like, I am a rich man, I have these statues. They are just, it's them. And look at us, we are considerably better. There's all these things, there's humor there, there's the unexpected thing, all these sorts of things which are going on. Which doesn't mean, of course, I want to stress this too, that ancient myths always have this rich potential. So if you want to read myths in a different way, if you as a disabled person, sort of recognize yourself in these ancient myths and you want to do something with it, that is perfectly possible, but I don't think that this is the way these myths were understood in antiquity. The very last slide. If you would ask me, could you please summarize your whole presentation just in one picture, I would choose this one. I hope it still is there in the same condition, because it comes from Antakya, which suffered a horrible earthquake, as you may remember, February 2003, the Museum of the Mosaics. Look at this, he looks at us, we look at him, of course, we're sort of triggered by certain details. He says, "Kaisu, you too. So don't stare at me, don't mock me too much. Kaisu can happen to you too. First look at yourself instead of just looking at me." If you ever want to know more about the whole subject, so together with Lisa Brunet, who is a doctor from our University of Manchester, and by the way, Annie was in the panel as an internal reviewer. Together with Lisa, I run this website, this release in the ancient world. It sort of brings together all people all over the world dealing with this, and it has a very long bibliography which I update like each single year. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Christian, for a very wide-ranging talk. So lots and lots of things to think about there. Christian will be happy to take questions, but just before that, we'll give him a moment's rest so that I can do a little bit of housekeeping for the branch. So this, of course, is our last meeting before the festive season. And I would like to emphasise now, of course, there are 12 days of Christmas and none of them are in November. But nonetheless, we won't be meeting until the new year, so I think it is appropriate to say I hope everyone does have a very pleasant festive season. When we come back in the new year, we begin with comedy, and we begin with a sort of double bill of comedy. So we're going to have Dr. Regina Mai from the University of Leeds come to talk to us on the 20th of March about a play by the comic poet Plautus, the Amphitryo. So should we feel sorry for Alcmena giving birth to Hercules in Plautus's Amphitryo? And so that people are genned up on this work, we are also going to do one of our play reading sessions prior to that, when we won't be doing this in Latin. Christian, I can see snarls at this point. We'll be doing this in English, and indeed Dr. Mai has translated this, and I'll be able to circulate a version that she's translated out of the play. So that will be on the 6th of March, to give people time to read through this, digest it. Obviously you don't have to come to that to listen to the talk, but we thought that perhaps some people might want to do that so that they can sort of build on their reading and then argue with Dr. Mai why she's wrong when she does her interpretation. So that's what's coming up in the new year. Once again, I think our Secretary Stephen has floated the idea of whether anyone will be interested in going on a trip. A trip to Oxford has been floated sometime in May, but we would need to know quite firmly whether you'll be interested in doing that by the end of this year, so that we can get on with the booking of coaches and stuff like that. Something else perhaps to look forward to, certainly I'm looking forward to in the new year, is towards the end of the new year, a travelling exhibition from the British Museum is wandering around. It's going to go to Chester, and it's about gladiators, so blood and gore, very much my sort of stuff. And again, maybe if there's interest, we can arrange a joint visit to Chester to have a look at this exhibition. But now, I think, if we've given Christian a little rest, if anyone has any questions to ask of him, I think he will be happy to field them.
Time limit?
Yes, Christian does have to get back. He's teaching, I mean, it's self-inflicted wound, I think, this, from 9 o'clock tomorrow, so he wants to get an earliest train back, so if we could round off by about 9, but that gives us a good 20 minutes or so for questions. Please do fire away.
And you can always send me an email also later on if you want to ask something. which often happens that people say, well, I don't want to discuss this in public or whatever, then I'd be happy to take any questions via email too. Please. As I always tell my students, there's nothing like a embarrassing or a silly question, so please do not be afraid. Just you can basically discuss whatever you like.
Speaking of blindness, Christian, what about Appius Claudius, blind censor?
Yeah.
Does he come out of this a little bit better than, you said there is no goodness in blindness in antiquity.
Yeah.
Is Claudius in that category, or is he actually pushing back against you a little bit?
Well, I think he was a senator before already, and so the idea is that he just can continue this. But again, I don't think that it's ever said that he was specially gifted or whatever because of that blindness. That was really the point I wanted to make. You have the practical difficulty also, but it describes how he gets to the Senate. And I would say that he's pretty much respected and revered also because of his old age, his wisdom, his experience. But as far as I know, there's nothing like really saying that the blindness himself really makes him special. It's just something that happens and people cope with it. That is very interesting. So often questions come down to this. So this is already described by Martha Rose in 2003, so-called community concept. So it means that disability can happen, caesu to you too, was much more sort of part of life. People were much more integrated into the community. That is obviously true. So for Appius Claudius, they just, they deal with it. But it's not always positive. Please think about this too. So people will just sometimes say, well, this was much better because you just were part of the community, but it sometimes also meant that you just had to do it in order to survive. What if you did not, like Appius Claudius, have a family to take care of you? What if you did not have slaves or servants to bring you to a certain place? There's of course no welfare, nothing, no compensation whatsoever. So it could also be community concept being integrated could also be a very gruesome and hard reality. If you think about bones, for instance, so osteology will show this time and again. So you see people, and we see that because of certain deformities or problems with the bones, that they must have suffered considerable pain. But you can also see from their bones that they worked, that they had worked a lot. They just had to. There was no choice. Don't ever let people tell you this literature like this, saying that pain is something culturally defined and relative. That is partly true. We're all human beings, so we share certain chemistry, we share certain physical things too, and there are just things that hurt for everyone throughout all cultures.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
The Emperor Claudius, on one hand, was regarded as an extremely wise man, and very educated. But on another, to some extent to do with his physical disability, he was regarded as a fool. Was there a connection made in antiquity between his intelligence and his misfortunes?
It is never explicitly said, but when you read the biography by Suetonius, he will mention both things. So he will say, already in his early youth, the imperial family liked to keep him away from the public, so something with the appearance, something with his behavior too. On the other hand, he studied, he knew how to read the Etruscan language and so on and so on. So it's basically both things are there. So there is the degrading thing of the disability, there's the ridiculizing, there's the mockery, and at the same time it's part of life, because he held certain functions. We also know that in his youth that every now and then he delivered a speech and we managed to do so. So both things sort of go together. I deal extensively with Claudius in my monograph and also in some separate articles, as the one on speech impairment, but not really in this book because it's not really a myth, of course. But I once did in Blackpool at the Sixth Form College. I did 2 talks, 2 different years, both on Claudius. So that is, of course, is a crucial individual to understand.
Would you like to comment, Christian, on the way that he portrays himself in a very heroic form, of course, in the East when he's shown conquering Britannia? So there you've got the heroised body with no trace of disability whatsoever.
There's plenty of statues of Claudius, and of course you don't notice anything. There's in Lyon the inscription of speech given by Claudius, so that was all there too. So it's not.
Are you likely to deliver a talk on Claudius?
I gladly do so. I have it prepared and everything, including the PowerPoint. So it's all there.
Yeah, Christy, it's been noted. I will gladly do so.
Claudius is really so. There's plenty of literature on him, but I always tell people go back to the text. It's really fascinating what he said. For instance, there's not one text saying that he was a stutterer. It's nowhere. It only says that in anger he could not control himself and that he was stumbling over his words, which is of course a different thing.
Yeah.
But then if you look at the Robert Grace book is fantastic, of course, but the image we now have of Claudius goes back to this, of course. I always imagine, what if there's a sort of satirical tradition now, as you may know, of course, on Joe Biden. What if only this text would survive, and perhaps after 2,000 years, what would we think? So it's documented that he had a problem of stuttering as a young boy. Now, don't really notice every now and then. Okay, but it depends, of course, on what you want to emphasize and whether you want to use it against him or not.
Given you looked at Indo-European mythology in general, Christian, one of the things that struck me there was that some of the myths are very noticeable. So you have the god Tyr and sacrifice of the hand, and Skyvola, who sort of does the same thing. But you also pointed out that in classical mythology there is no reward for disability, and that's strikingly different, isn't it, from some other parts of the European tradition. So Odin, for example, sacrifices an eye to gain wisdom, and the two are very directly related to one another. You mentioned a couple of Indian gods who seemingly went through the same sort of process. So why in that respect do you feel that the classical world is the exception that proves the rule, so to speak? So what happened in the classical world that this idea dropped out of mythology, if that's what you think happened?
I would have to have a look, of course, at the specific versions of the surely for the Indian mythology. But would you agree that the idea of compensation always also involves sort of suffering, something that needs to be restored?
I don't know. As far as I know, Odin never tries to get his eye back. Nor does he ever have an artificial eye, which again pops up in some sort of mythology, doesn't there? You have a sort of glass eye where you can see another world or something like that. Well, that doesn't happen. Odin sacrifices the eye, he hangs on the tree to gain knowledge. And seemingly, that is a good deal. You know, you've lost an eye, but you can still see, you're a one-eyed man, and again, the trope of the one-eyed man, I think, is very, very interesting in classical history. But here, the compensation doesn't seem to be anything that one has lost permanently. Perhaps that's because there are two eyes. I mean, Odin is not blinded to get knowledge. He loses a little bit, but gains more off the back of the loss. I don't know.
And I would say why that is, I'm not sure, but I would surely say that this is not really there in Greco-Roman mythology.
No, exactly.
So for Skyvola also, there's nothing which makes him better of not having this right arm.
No, although I think for any Roman, losing one's right arm is much worse than the reputation. So Odin loses a little but gains a lot. But the curious thing for me is that this idea of sacrificing for a greater good is predominant in most strands of Indo-European mythology. But my question would be, why do you feel it's dropped away from Greco-Roman mythology in the way that you demonstrated it had?
I'm not sure. It seems to be a different tradition indeed than. Maybe the sort of recognition that this is, that disabilities are there in life, and perhaps these gods, who are not like these very supreme gods, more like we part of the world, that might play a role there. It's very hard to find out, of course, but you're right that there seems to be.
No, it's a rotten question. I know. It's like how long is a piece of string question.
I would search in that direction, so that gods are more like part of a world, not too distant, almighty gods, and then that these things can happen to them too. Yeah. Also, so I've dealt with that in other publications, not so much here. So I would say if you're looking for categories of disabilities in antiquity, look at indeed the concept of incurability. So there were, of course, cases in which people understood, well, a doctor doesn't really help. We've tried perhaps a magician or something with tablets, or doesn't work. Let's go to the sanctuary. And maybe it can work, and of course we have plenty of attestations of this miraculous healing, including people being able to talk again or to see again. So these things are there. So there's some interesting publications there that once people understand that nothing can be done, that this comes close to disability already. This is not having a fever or a cold or something. It's something that will be permanent. So I need to go perhaps to the sanctuary because of this. And on the other hand, that is also interesting to think about, there's some cases for which people never ever went to the sanctuary, and I'm thinking about what we would call, on which I did a whole book, congenital intellectual disability. So the idea that someone just doesn't have the right intellectual development you'd expect. There's not one case of a person going to a sanctuary for this. Neither did Jesus heal these people. It's only about demonic possession, which is a different thing. So I think that in practice, people realize that some things would be there forever, that nothing could be done. Of course, I don't want to ridiculize things now, but for instance, there's not one attestation of someone going with an amputated limb and the limb growing again. There's not one attestation of a dwarf suddenly growing. That Jesus doesn't do these miracles, but it's also not there in the ancient miracle tradition. So that is the whole idea of things can be praeter naturam, so not really what you expect, but it happens with contra naturam, so really going against nature. That is the thing. People realize that this is not possible.
And on that note, it won't be possible for Christian to go home unless we make a move. So I'd like to...
Unless I do bilocatio by
indeed,
that is of course contra naturam.
I have seen two tombs of St. Catherine. She could be in two places because I've never seen them both at the same time. But on that note, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Christian.